Chapter 1. The Stranger's Arrival. The train rattled to a stop at the edge of St. Clary, a speck of a village nestled in a hollow where the hills seemed to lean in and listen. Miss Jane Marple stepped onto the platform, her sensible shoes tapping lightly against the warped wood, her sharp eyes scanning the mist that clung to the rooftops like a shroud. She adjusted her hat, a modest affair with a single feather, and pulled her coat tighter against the damp chill. The station-master, a wiry man with a face like crumpled paper, tipped his cap but said nothing, his gaze flickering nervously toward the church spire, piercing the fog. St. Clary was not a place people visited by chance. Miss Marple had come at the insistence of her nephew, Raymond, who'd received a cryptic letter from an old university friend, now a vicar here. "Something's stirring in the village," the letter had read. "Something I can't explain. The bell rings at midnight, and the air turns cold with dread." Raymond had laughed it off as melodramatic nonsense, but Miss Marple, with her unerring knack for sensing trouble beneath the surface, had packed her knitting and booked a ticket. The village square was eerily quiet as she made her way toward the vicarage, her small suitcase bumping along the cobblestones. A few villagers lingered, a butcher wiping his hands on a stained apron, a woman peering from behind lace curtains, but they watched her with the wary curiosity reserved for outsiders. The church loomed ahead, its ancient stone blackened by time, the bell tower rising like a crooked finger pointing at the sky. Miss Marple paused, tilting her head. The air felt heavy, expectant, as if the village held its breath. She'd barely knocked on the vicarage door when it swung open, revealing Reverend Thomas Hale, a lanky man with a mop of greying hair and eyes that darted like a hunted animal's. "Miss Marple, thank heavens you're here," he said, ushering her inside. The parlour smelled of damp wood and old books, a fire crackling feebly in the grate. "I didn't know who else to turn to. It's the bell, you see. It started 3 nights ago, ringing at midnight, sharp and clear, though no one's touched the ropes in years." Miss Marple settled into a threadbare armchair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "An old bell, you say? Perhaps a prankster, or the wind playing tricks?" "No, no," Hale said, shaking his head so vigorously his glasses slipped. "The tower's locked tight, and the wind doesn't toll a bell like that. Slow, deliberate 5 times, then silence. The villagers are terrified. They say it's a harbinger, like in the old stories, and last night—" His voice dropped to a whisper. "Last night, after it rang, I saw something, a shadow moving near the tower, too quick to be human." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. She'd heard tales of haunted bells before, but she knew better than to trust superstition over observation. "Interesting," she murmured, her mind already spinning like the needles she'd soon unpack. "Very interesting indeed. Tell me, Reverend, who else heard it?" "Half the village, I'd wager," he replied. "The butcher, old Mrs. Finch, even young Eliza, who runs the bakery. They're all on edge, whispering about curses and judgments. I'd dismiss it as nonsense, but that shadow, it chilled me to the bone." Before Miss Marple could press further, the clock on the mantel struck 11, its chimes thin and tinny. Hale stiffened, his face paling. 1 hour, he muttered. 1 hour until it rings again." Miss Marple smiled faintly, a calm certainty settling over her. "Then we shall listen, Reverend, and see what this midnight bell has to tell us. Outside, the mist thickened, curling around the bell tower, like fingers reaching for a secret, and somewhere in the dark, a sound waited to be born. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Shadow. The vicarage clock ticked toward midnight with a relentless precision that seemed to mock the nervous fidgeting of Reverend Hale. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly, a ball of pale blue wool unspooling in her lap. The fire had dwindled to embers, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Outside, the village of St. Clary lay hushed, the mist pressing against the glass like a living thing. "Perhaps it won't ring tonight," Hale ventured, his voice thin with hope. He stood by the hearth, twisting a handkerchief between his fingers. "Perhaps it's done with us." Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Oh, I rather think it's only beginning," she said, her eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the bell tower beyond the square. She'd seen enough of human nature to know that patterns once started rarely stopped without reason. As the clock's hands aligned at 12, a low vibration rippled through the room. Not a sound yet, but a feeling, like the earth itself holding its breath. Then it came, a single resonant toll from the bell tower, deep and mournful, cutting through the silence. Hale flinched, dropping his handkerchief. A second toll followed, then a third, each one slower than the last, as if the bell savoured its own voice. 4, 5, and then nothing, just the echo fading into the night. "There," Hale whispered, his face ashen. "You heard it. 5 tolls, just like before." Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose, peering out the window. "Yes," she said thoughtfully, "but did you see it?" Hale joined her, squinting into the gloom. "See what?" For a moment there was only mist and shadow. Then, fleeting as a dream, a figure darted across the square, a dark shape, too swift and fluid to be a villager stumbling home. It vanished near the base of the bell tower, swallowed by the fog. Hale gasped, clutching the windowsill. "The shadow! It's real!" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind already sifting through possibilities. "Real, yes," she murmured, "but not necessarily what it seems." The next morning, the village buzzed with a different kind of unease. Miss Marple stepped out of the vicarage to find a small crowd gathered near the bakery, their voices sharp with alarm. At the centre stood Eliza, the young baker, her flour-dusted apron twisted in her hands as she spoke to the butcher, Mr. Grayson. "He's gone," she was saying, her voice trembling. "Jacob's gone, and he never misses a dawn delivery." "Jacob?" Miss Marple asked, slipping into the group with the quiet grace of someone who belonged anywhere she chose to be. Eliza turned, startled. "Jacob Wren, the artist, lives up by the old mill. He paints the tower, says it's his muse. He was meant to bring a canvas this morning, but his cottage is empty. Door wide open, paint still wet on the easel." Intrigued, Miss Marple followed, Eliza and a few curious villagers to Jacob's cottage, a ramshackle place perched on a rise overlooking the village. The door hung ajar, creaking in the breeze, and inside the air smelled of turpentine and damp earth. A half-finished painting stood on an easel, the bell tower under a crimson moon, its brushstrokes wild and urgent. But what caught Miss Marple's eye was a detail in the corner, a faint, shadowy figure lurking near the tower, rendered in quick, jagged lines. "He saw it too," she murmured, her fingers brushing the edge of the canvas. "And now he's gone." A shout from outside broke her reverie. Mr. Grayson stumbled in, his ruddy face pale. "You'd better come quick, miss. They've found something by the tower." Miss Marple hurried after him, her heart quickening, not with fear, but with the thrill of a puzzle taking shape. At the base of the bell tower, a small crowd had gathered, staring at a crumpled heap in the grass. It was Jacob Wren, his lifeless eyes wide open, his hands streaked with paint. Above him, the bell hung silent, its rope untouched, swaying faintly, as if mocking the scene below. "Dead," Grayson muttered, "and not a mark on him. How's that possible?" Miss Marple knelt beside the body, her keen gaze sweeping over the artist's frozen expression. "Oh, it's possible," she said softly, "but not simple at all." The mist curled around them, and somewhere in its depths the shadow waited. Chapter 3. The locked tower. The morning sun struggled to pierce the mist shrouding St. Clary, casting a weak grey light over the bell tower where Jacob Wren lay dead. A small knot of villagers hovered at a respectful distance, their whispers a low hum of fear and fascination. Miss Marple stood near the body, her hands clasped behind her back, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The dew-soaked grass, the artist's paint-stained fingers, the unnatural stillness of his face. Beside her, Constable Perry, a stocky man with a bristling moustache, scratched his head and muttered about calling for reinforcements from the county. "No marks, no blood," Perry said, crouching awkwardly beside Jacob. "Looks like he just stopped. Heart, maybe. Too much drink." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. She glanced up at the bell tower, its weathered stones looming like a sentinel. "Constable, has anyone been inside since last night?" Perry shook his head. "Couldn't if they wanted to. Door's locked tight. Always is, unless the vicar's ringing for service. And that bell hasn't been rung proper in years, not since the rope, snapped back in '09. Reverend Hale keeps the only key." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. She stepped closer to the tower, her shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. The door was a slab of oak, banded with iron, its surface pitted with age. A heavy padlock hung from a rusted hasp, undisturbed, the keyhole clogged with grime. She rapped her knuckles against the wood, producing a dull thud. Solid as a vault, and yet that bell rang 5 times at midnight. Perry frowned, tugging at his moustache. Wind, maybe, or some trick of the beams shifting. Miss Marple's lips quirked into a faint smile. "Wind doesn't count to 5, Constable, nor does it paint shadows on a canvas." She turned back to the crowd, spotting Reverend Hale pushing through, his face a mask of distress. "Miss Marple," he called, clutching his keyring so tightly his knuckles whitened. "They're saying Jacob's dead! Right here, under the tower! It's the bell, isn't it? It's claimed him." "Let's not leap to curses just yet," she replied calmly. "May I borrow that key, Reverend? I'd like to see inside." Hale hesitated, then handed it over with a trembling hand. "Be careful, it feels wrong in there." The padlock groaned as Miss Marple turned the key, the mechanism stiff with disuse. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow spiral staircase cloaked in shadow. A musty smell wafted out, damp stone and something faintly metallic. With Perry at her heels, she ascended, her steps slow but steady, her hand brushing the cold wall for balance. At the top, the bell chamber opened before them, a cramped space dominated by the massive bronze bell, its surface etched with faded runes. The rope dangled, frayed and broken halfway down, swaying gently though no breeze stirred the air. Dust coated the floor, undisturbed except for a single set of footprints, small, uneven, leading to the bell and back. "Someone's been here," Perry said, his voice echoing off the stones. "But how? The door was locked and there's no other way in, no windows, no trapdoors. Roof's solid slate." Miss Marple knelt by the footprints, tracing their outline with a finger. "A woman's shoe, I'd wager. Narrow heel, slight scuff at the toe. And look!" She pointed to a faint smear of red near the bell's base. "Paint! Fresh, like Jacob's!" Perry gaped. "You're saying a woman got in here, locked the door behind her and— What? Killed him from up here? He was outside, Miss Marple, and not a scratch on him. Not killed, perhaps," she said, rising. "Not in the usual way. But something happened here, something that ended with Jacob dead below." She crossed to the bell, peering at its rim. A thin scratch marred the metal, recent and deliberate, glinting in the dim light. "This bell has a story, Constable, and it's not finished telling it." As they descended, Perry locking the door behind them, Miss Marple's mind whirred. A locked tower, a dead artist, a bell that rang without a ringer. Impossible, they'd call it. But she knew better. The unsolvable was only a matter of perspective, and she intended to shift hers until the pieces fit. Outside, the crowd had grown, their eyes following her like hounds on a scent. She handed the key back to Hale, her voice low. "Reverend, who else in St. Clary knew Jacob well?" Hale blinked. "Eliza, I suppose. She bought his paintings. And Mrs. Finch, the old widow. She'd sit for him sometimes, muttering about the tower's curse." Miss Marple nodded, filing the names away. The bell tower stood silent now, but its shadow stretched long across the village, hiding secrets she was determined to unearth. Chapter 4. Echoes of a Curse. The afternoon sky over St. Clary hung heavy with clouds, casting the village in a muted gloom that matched the mood of its inhabitants. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage parlour, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, her knitting abandoned for the moment, as she listened to Reverend Hale recount the old tales of the bell. His voice was hushed, as if the walls themselves might overhear and take offence. "It's been whispered for generations," he said, perched on the edge of his chair. "The midnight bell rings when a sinner's time is up. 5 tolls for 5 sins, they say. Murder, theft, betrayal, envy, and pride. The last time it rang was 50 years ago, when old man Carver dropped dead in the square. Heart gave out, or so they claimed, but he'd been a cruel sort, beat his wife, cheated his neighbours. Folks said the bell judged him." Miss Marple sipped, her tea, her expression serene, but her mind alert. "A convenient story," she remarked. "And Jacob Wren? Was he a sinner in the village's eyes?" Hale hesitated, running a hand through his dishevelled hair. "Not that I'd heard. Quiet man, kept to himself. Painted the tower obsessively, mind you. Some called it unnatural. But sin? Hardly. Though—" He trailed off, frowning. "Go on," she prompted gently. There was a row a fortnight back. Jacob and Mrs. Finch outside the bakery. She was shouting about the tower, saying he'd stir up trouble painting it like that. Blood on the moon, she called it. He laughed her off, but she's a queer bun, always muttering about the curse. Miss Marple set her cup down, her eyes bright with interest. Mrs. Finch, you say? I think I'll pay her a visit. A curse is only as strong as the people who believe it, Reverend, and those who use it. Leaving Hale to his fretting, she made her way across the village to the widow's cottage, a crooked little place tucked behind a gnarled oak. The door was ajar, and a sharp voice called out before she could knock. "If it's about bread, I've none to spare." "It's not bread I'm after, Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple replied, stepping inside. The room was dim, cluttered with faded photographs and chipped china. Mrs. Finch sat by the window, a wiry figure in black, her white hair pulled into a severe bun. Her eyes, sharp as flint, fixed on Miss Marple with suspicion. "You're the stranger poking about," she said, her voice like dry leaves rustling. "Heard you were at the tower this morning. Found Jacob, did you?" "I did, yes," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair without invitation. "A terrible thing. You knew him well, I understand." Mrs. Finch snorted. "Knew him enough. Daft boy, always painting that cursed tower. I told him, it'd bring the bell down on us again. And now look, dead, and the ringing started, 5 tolls, just like before." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Before? You mean Carver's time?" The widow's gaze flickered, a shadow crossing her face. I was a girl then, but I remember. Night after night that bell rang, and folk died. Carver, then the miller's wife, then young Tom, who stole from the church. 5 tolls each time till it stopped. My mother said it was the tower's judgment, carved into the bell by the first vicar to punish the wicked. "An interesting notion," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "But bells don't judge, Mrs. Finch. People do. Tell me, why did you argue with Jacob?" Mrs. Finch's hands tightened on her shawl. "He mocked me, said the curse was rot, that he'd paint the truth of it. Truth. His last canvas had blood on it. Blood. And now he's paid for his blasphemy." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the widow's words like stones in a stream. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch. You've been most helpful." As she left, the air grew colder, the clouds pressing lower. The story of the curse was vivid, compelling, but Miss Marple didn't believe in vengeful bells. She believed in vengeful people. Jacob's death, the locked tower, the shadow in the night, it all pointed to a human hand, one clever enough to wield superstition like a weapon. She paused by the churchyard, glancing at the tower. The scratch on the bell nagged at her, a detail, out of place, and those footprints, small, feminine. Mrs. Finch's shoes were sturdy, broad-toed, not a match. But someone had been up there, and someone had known Jacob's habits well enough to lure him to his death. The village watched her as she walked back to the vicarage, their eyes wary. The curse was a thread running through St. Clary's history, but Miss Marple suspected it was a veil, hiding a truth far more tangible and far more dangerous. Chapter 5. The Clockmaker's Tale. The evening settled over St. Clary like a heavy cloak, the village lamps flickering weakly against the encroaching dark. Miss Marple made her way to the edge of the square, where a narrow lane led to a peculiar shop she'd noticed earlier. A sign reading "Tinker's Clocks" swung above. The door, its paint peeling but its promise intriguing. If anyone knew the mechanics behind a bell that rang without a ringer, it might be the village clockmaker. She pushed the door open, a bell above jingling sharply. Ironic, she thought, given her purpose. The shop was a chaos of ticking and whirring. Clocks of every size lined the walls, their faces glowing faintly in the lamplight, while gears and springs spilled across a cluttered workbench. At its centre sat an old man, hunched over a pocket watch, his gnarled fingers wielding a tiny screwdriver with surprising dexterity. His hair was a wild shock of white, his eyes magnified by thick spectacles that slid down his nose as he looked up. "Who's this, then?" he rasped, his voice rough as gravel. "Not here for a cuckoo, are you?" Miss Marple smiled, stepping closer. "Not quite, mister. Tinker. Just Tinker. No mister about it." He set the watch down, peering at her with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "You're the one sniffing round the tower, eh? After poor Jacob?" "I am," she said, unfazed by his bluntness. "Miss Jane Marple, I understand you've lived here a long while, Tinker. I'd like to hear what you know about the bell." Tinker chuckled, a dry, wheezing sound. "Know about it? I've cursed. It plenty, that's what. Been here 60 years, fixed every clock in St. Clary. But that bell's a beast I never touched. Vicar won't let me near it, says it's sacred, or some rot. Rings on its own now, does it?" 5 times at midnight, Miss Marple confirmed, watching him closely. "No rope, no ringer, yet it tolls. You're a man of mechanisms, Tinker. How might that happen?" He leaned back, scratching his stubbled chin. "Well now, that's a question. Bells don't ring themselves, sacred or not. Could be a weight-and-pulley job, hidden in the frame, old trick from the cathedral builders, or a clockwork trigger, set to trip at midnight. But you'd need access, and that tower's locked tighter'n a miser's purse." "Someone got in," she said, her tone mild but firm. "Footprints, paint, a scratch on the bell. And Jacob? Wren died beneath it." Tinker's eyes narrowed, a glint of something, respect perhaps, flickering behind his lenses. "Sharp one, aren't you?" I heard about Jacob. Painted the tower like it owed him money. Came to me once, asking if I could rig a chime for his studio. Wanted it to mimic the bell, for inspiration. I told him he'd do better to leave it alone. "Did he mention anyone else?" Miss Marple pressed. "Someone who might have known his habits?" Tinker paused, tapping a finger against the bench. "Eliza, maybe. The baker girl. She'd bring him loaves, linger while he rambled about his canvases, quiet thing. But she listened and—" He stopped, his brow furrowing. "And?" Miss Marple prompted, her voice soft as a whisper. "Day before he died, I saw her here buying wire. Thin stuff, strong, clockmaker's wire, not baker's. Said it was for hanging a shelf, but her hands shook when she paid. Odd that. It's Miss Marple's mind seized the detail like a hawk on prey. Wire strong, subtle. Could it be part of a mechanism? Eliza's shoes might match those footprints too. She'd have to check. "Thank you, Tinker," she said, rising. "You've given me something to ponder." "Ponder quick," he called as she reached the door. "That bell's got a rhythm now. It'll ring again, mark my words." Outside the night was thick, the air buzzing with anticipation. Miss Marple glanced toward the bakery, its windows dark, then at the tower, a black silhouette against the sky. Tinker's tale had cracked open a new angle, not curses, but craft. Someone in St. Clary was playing a clever game, and she intended to learn the rules. As she walked back to the vicarage, a distant owl hooted, its cry swallowed by the stillness. Midnight was hours away, but the bell's shadow loomed larger than ever. Chapter 6. The Second Toll. The clock in the vicarage parlour ticked toward midnight with a steady, unyielding rhythm, each second sharpening the tension in the air. Miss Marple sat by the window again, her knitting needles idle, her gaze fixed on the bell tower's faint outline through the thinning mist. Reverend Hale paced behind her, his footsteps muffled by the worn rug, his mutterings a low drone of worry. "It's been quiet all day," he said, more to himself than to her. "Perhaps it's over. Perhaps Jacob's death was the end of it." Miss Marple didn't reply, but her silence spoke volumes. She'd spent the afternoon discreetly observing Eliza at the bakery, her small, quick hands kneading dough, her shoes indeed narrow-heeled, though too flour-dusted to confirm a match with the tower's footprints. The wire Tinker mentioned gnawed at her thoughts, a thread she couldn't yet tie to the bell's eerie tolls. She needed more, another piece of the puzzle. As the clock struck 12, the first toll rang out, deep and resonant, vibrating through the walls. Hale froze mid-step, his breath catching. A second toll followed, then a third, each one deliberate, heavy with intent. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. 4, 5, and then a scream, sharp and piercing, cut through the night. From across the square, Hale bolted to the window, nearly knocking over a lamp. "Good Lord, what now?" Miss Marple was already on her feet, pulling her coat around her shoulders. "Come, Reverend, we must see." They hurried outside, the cold biting at their faces as they crossed the square toward the source of the cry. A small crowd had gathered near the widow's cottage, their lanterns casting jittery pools of light. Mrs. Finch stood at the edge, her shawl clutched tight, her face a mask of grim satisfaction. "I told you," she crowed. "The bells! Judgment!" In the grass lay a young woman, crumpled like a discarded doll. It was Clara Dunn, the vicar's housekeeper, a widow in her 30s, known for her soft voice and nervous smile. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth frozen mid-scream, a crumpled note clutched in her rigid hand. Constable Perry knelt beside her, his face pale as he shook his head. "Dead," he said gruffly, glancing up at Miss Marple. "Same as Jacob. No marks, no blood. Just gone. And this." He pried the note from her fingers, handing it over. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. Scrawled in a shaky hand were the words, "5 tolls for 5 sins. Yours is next." The tattoo ink was fresh, smudged at the edges, as if written in haste. Hale clutched his collar, his voice trembling. Clara? A sinner? She was gentle as a lamb, kept the vicarage spotless, never a harsh word. "Gentleness doesn't exempt one from secrets," Miss Marple said quietly, folding the note into her pocket. She scanned the crowd, Mrs. Finch's triumphant glare, Eliza hovering at the back with wide eyes, Mr. Grayson the butcher shifting uncomfortably. The bell tower loomed behind them, its silence now a taunt. Perry stood, brushing dirt from his knees. 2 deaths in 3 days, and that blasted bell ringing each time. Miss Marple, you've got a theory, I'll wager." "Not yet a theory," she replied, her tone measured. "But a pattern. Jacob died beneath the tower, Clara here in the open, both after the bell, both with no cause we can see. And now this note, a warning or a boast." Mrs. Finch stepped forward, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "It's the curse, plain as day. Clara's husband drowned years back. Folks said she pushed him, though none could prove it. Sin catches up, and the bell knows." Miss Marple turned to her, her gaze steady. "Does it, Mrs. Finch? Or does someone want us to think so?" The Ahe widow bristled but said nothing, retreating into the crowd. Miss Marple knelt by Clara's body, noting the faint tremor in her fingers, the way her head tilted slightly toward the tower. Something had terrified her in her final moment. Something real, not spectral. As the villagers dispersed, whispering of curses and judgment, Miss Marple lingered, her mind racing. 2 deaths, 2 tolls, and a note that promised more. The bell was no phantom. It was a tool, and someone wielded it with chilling precision. She needed to find the hand behind it before the next midnight struck. Chapter 7. The Hidden Mechanism. The morning after Clara's death dawned grey and restless, the wind rattling the vicarage windows as if urging the village awake. Miss Marple sat at the breakfast table, a slice of toast untouched before her, her mind far from the mundane comforts of tea and jam. The note from Clara's hand. 5 tolls for 5 sins. Yours is next. Lay smoothed out beside her plate, its words a riddle she was determined to crack. Reverend Hale had taken to his bed, overwhelmed by the second death under his watch, leaving her to ponder alone. 2 victims, both dead without a visible cause, both tied to the bell's midnight tolls. Jacob beneath the tower, Clara in the square, and now a threat hanging over someone else. The curse was a distraction, she was certain. Superstition draped over a calculated act. But how? The locked tower, the broken rope, the footprints, they pointed to a human hand, yet the mechanism eluded her. She rose, slipping the note into her pocket, and made for the bell tower once more. Constable Perry met her there, his face drawn from a sleepless night, the key from Hale in his hand. "Back again, Miss Marple," he said, unlocking the door. "You're like a dog with a bone." "A bone worth chewing, Constable," she replied, stepping inside. The air was colder today, the spiral stairs slick with damp. She climbed with care, her eyes tracing the walls for anything she'd missed. In the bell chamber, the great bronze bell hung as before, its runes faintly gleaming in the weak light filtering through a crack in the slate roof. The footprints remained faint but distinct, and the smear of red paint glistened near the base. Miss Marple circled the bell, her fingers brushing the scratch she'd noticed before. A thin, deliberate mark, too precise for accident. "Perry," she called, her voice echoing softly. "Bring your lantern closer." He obliged, holding the light steady as she knelt. The scratch wasn't alone. Beside it, barely visible against the patina, was a hairline seam, a narrow slot cut into the bell's rim. She pressed a fingernail against it, feeling a slight give. "Curiouser and curiouser," she murmured. "What's that?" Perry asked, squinting. "A hiding place, perhaps," she said. From her handbag, she produced a knitting needle, slender, steel-tipped, and slid it into the slot. With a gentle twist, a small panel clicked open, revealing a hollow within the bell's thick wall. Inside lay a coiled length of wire, thin, strong, glinting like the kind Tinker had described, and a tiny brass cog, no bigger than a shilling. Perry whistled low. A mechanism, then. But for what? Miss Marple extracted the items, holding them to the light. To ring the bell, I suspect, without a ringer. Wire could trip a hammer or pull a lever, and this cog, part of a timer perhaps, set to midnight. Someone built this, Constable, and hid it well. He scratched his head, but the tower was locked, and how's it killing folk outside? That, she said, rising, is the next question. The bell's a signal or a distraction. The deaths are the real trick, and I'll wager they're not as mysterious as they seem. They descended, Perry locking the door behind them, the wire and cog tucked safely in Miss Marple's bag. Her mind buzzed with new connections. Tinker's wire, Eliza's purchase, the footprints. But the how and why still danced out of reach. Poison, perhaps? A silent weapon? She needed to test the ground where Clara fell, and revisit Jacob's body if she could. As they stepped into the square, a figure emerged from the mist. Eliza, her apron dusted with flour, her face pale. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice unsteady. "I heard about Clara. Is it true, the bell again?" "It rang, yes," Miss Marple replied, watching her closely. "You were fond of her, weren't you?" Eliza nodded, twisting her hands. "She'd bring me tea sometimes when I worked late. She didn't deserve this." Her eyes darted to the tower, then away. "People are saying it's cursed, that it'll take more of us." "People say many things," Miss Marple said gently. "But I find the truth lies in what they don't say. Tell me, Eliza, did Clara ever mention anything odd? About Jacob or the tower?" Eliza hesitated, then shook her head. "No, nothing. She was just scared lately. Kept looking over her shoulder." Miss Marple thanked her, letting her slip back to the bakery. But the girl's unease lingered in her thoughts. Fear was a thread running through St. Clary, and someone was pulling it tight. The bell tower stood silent, its secret partly revealed. But the mechanism was only half the story, and Miss Marple knew the other half was out there, waiting to strike again. Chapter 8. The Artist's Legacy. The afternoon light slanted low across St. Clary, painting the village in hues of gold and shadow as Miss Marple made her way back to Jacob Wren's cottage. The discovery of the bell's hidden mechanism, a wire and cog tucked within its rim, had shifted her perspective. But the puzzle remained incomplete. How did a ringing bell kill without a mark? And who had set it in motion? The answers, she suspected, lay not just in the tower, but in the life of its first victim. The cottage door still hung ajar, creaking faintly as she stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of paint and solitude. Jacob's half-finished canvas stood on its easel, a haunting vision of the bell tower beneath a blood-red moon. Miss Marple approached it, her eyes tracing the wild brushstrokes, the jagged lines of the shadow lurking near the tower's base. She'd dismissed it as artistic flourish before, but now, with Clara's death and the note's threat, it felt like more, a witness to something real. She tilted her head, studying, The shadow's shape. It wasn't formless. There was intent in its rendering. A slight curve at the shoulder. A hint of a cloak or coat. A suggestion of height. She rummaged in her bag, pulling out a small magnifying glass she kept for reading fine print, and held it to the canvas. Up close, the shadow revealed a detail she'd missed. A thin line across its middle, glinting faintly in the paint. Gold, or perhaps brass. A belt? A chain? "Jacob saw you," she murmured, her voice soft in the empty room. "And you didn't like it." She turned from the painting, scanning the cottage for anything else he might have left behind. His workbench was a clutter of brushes and tubes, but beneath a rag lay a sketchbook, its pages warped from damp. She flipped it open, finding quick studies of the tower, the moon, the village square, obsessive, almost feverish. Near the back, a rough drawing caught her eye. The bell itself, with a figure standing beside it. The figure was vague, but the same glinting line crossed its waist, and beside it, in Jacob's scrawled hand, were the words, "He watches at dusk." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Not a woman, then, not the footprint's owner, but a man, seen by Jacob in the fading light. Someone who'd been near the tower before the ringing began. She tucked the sketchbook into her bag, her mind racing. The mechanism suggested a woman's involvement. Eliza, perhaps with her wire and small shoes, but this pointed elsewhere, to a second player. She left the cottage and headed for the square, intent on asking Tinker about any men who lingered near the tower at dusk. The clockmaker's shop was quiet when she arrived. The old man hunched over a mantel clock, muttering to himself. He glanced up as she entered, his spectacles catching the lamplight. "Back so soon?" he said, setting his tools down. "What's it now? More bell nonsense." "A different sort of nonsense," Miss Marple replied, placing the sketchbook on his bench and opening it to the drawing. "Jacob left this. A man by the tower watching at dusk. Does it stir any memories?" Tinker squinted at the page, his brow furrowing. "Dusk, eh? Most folk are indoors by then, supping or sleeping, but, aye, there's one who's out late. Grayson, the butcher. Big lad, always about with his apron off, checking his traps round the village edge. Seen him near the tower once or twice, fiddling with something. Thought he was after rabbits." Miss Marple nodded, the glinting line in the drawing taking shape in her mind. Grayson's heavy brass belt buckle, a gaudy thing she'd noticed in the crowd. Did he know Jacob well? "Well enough," Tinker said, shrugging. "Bought meat from him regular, grumbled when Jacob paid late. Never saw 'em friendly, mind." "Thank you, Tinker," she said, retrieving the sketchbook. "You've been a great help." As she stepped outside, the sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows across St. Clary. Grayson, a man of strength, with access to the village's edges, and a temper if provoked. Could he be the he Jacob saw? And if so, how did he connect to the bell, and to Clara? Miss Marple glanced at the tower, its silhouette stark against the twilight. The painting and sketch were Jacob's legacy, a warning in pigment and charcoal. She was closing in, but the night loomed, and with it the threat of another toll. Chapter 9. The Midnight Watcher. The night settled over St. Clary with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the village itself conspired to muffle its secrets. Miss Marple stood at the vicarage window, a shawl draped over her shoulders against the chill, her eyes trained on the bell tower across the square. The clock ticked toward 11, its hands creeping closer to the hour she'd come to anticipate. With a mix of dread and curiosity, she'd decided to watch tonight, not just listen, hoping to catch a glimpse of the shadow that haunted Jacob's painting and the village's fears. Reverend Hale had retired early again, his nerves frayed by Clara's death, and the note's ominous promise. Miss Marple had declined his offer of tea, preferring the clarity of an unburdened mind. The wire and cog from the bell, Grayson's brass buckle, Eliza's nervous hands. They swirled in her thoughts, pieces of a mosaic she was piecing together in the dark. As the clock struck 11:30, she slipped out of the vicarage, moving with the quiet grace of someone accustomed to going unnoticed. She positioned herself behind a gnarled tree near the square's edge, its branches offering cover while granting a clear view of the tower. The mist had lifted, leaving the night crisp and sharp, the stars pinpricks above the slate roof. Minutes ticked by, marked only by the faint rustle of leaves and her steady breathing. Then, just as the clock began its midnight chime, movement flickered near the tower. A figure, cloaked in shadow, darting from the churchyard's low wall toward the base. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she held still, her eyes narrowing to catch details. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, the faint glint of something metallic at the waist catching the moonlight. Grayson, she'd wager, with that unmistakable buckle. He paused by the tower door, his head turning as if to check for watchers, then knelt, fumbling with something low to the ground. Not the lock, too low for that, but perhaps a hidden latch or wire. Before she could discern more, the bell tolled, its first deep note reverberating through the square. Grayson flinched, then bolted, vanishing into the alley beside the butcher's shop. As the second toll rang out, Miss Marple counted 3, 4, 5, and waited, expecting another scream, another body. But the night remained silent, the tolls fading into an eerie calm. She stepped from her hiding place, her mind racing. No death this time. Why? Was the pattern broken, or had the note's threat been a bluff? She approached the tower, careful to keep her steps light, and crouched where Grayson had knelt. The grass was trampled, and there, tucked beneath a jutting stone, was a thin wire, similar to the one from the bell, but trailing into the earth like a snake slithering home. She tugged gently, feeling resistance, then let it be. A trap, perhaps, or part of the mechanism's reach beyond the tower itself. Rising, she glanced toward the butcher's shop, its windows dark. Grayson's flight suggested guilt, or fear. He'd been at the tower, but not inside. The footprints and the bell's internal device pointed elsewhere. To Eliza, maybe, or another yet unseen. 2 hands at work, then. One to rig the bell, one to use it as cover. She returned to the vicarage, her thoughts a tangle of threads pulling tight. Jacob's painting had led her to Grayson, but the baker girl's wire and those small shoes still lingered. The bell was a puppet, its strings pulled by human cunning, and tonight's silence only deepened the mystery. Had Grayson aborted his plan, sensing eyes on him? Or was the next strike waiting for a different midnight? Miss Marple locked the door behind her, settling back by the window. The tower stood mute, but its shadow stretched long, and she knew she'd rattled someone. Tomorrow she'd confront the butcher, and perhaps force the other hand to show itself. Chapter 10. The Sound of Truth. The morning sun crept over St. Clary, its light pale and hesitant, as if reluctant to illuminate the secrets festering beneath the village's calm facade. Miss Marple rose early, her mind sharpened by the previous night's vigil, Grayson's furtive movements by the tower, the wire in the grass, the bell's tolls without a death, all pointed to a plan interrupted, and she intended to press that advantage before the culprit regrouped. She made her way to the butcher's shop, her steps brisk despite the ache in her knees from hours of standing. The shop was quiet, its shutters half open, the scent of raw meat wafting through the air. Mr. Grayson stood behind the counter, cleaver in hand, his broad frame tense as he hacked at a slab of beef. His brass buckle gleamed at his waist, a glaring match to Jacob's sketch. "Good morning, Mr. Grayson," Miss Marple said, her voice bright but edged with purpose as she stepped inside. He glanced up, his ruddy face tightening. "Morning, miss. What's an old lady like you want with a butcher this early?" "Oh, just a chat," she replied, resting her hands on her handbag. "About the tower, and last night. I saw you there, you know, at midnight when the bell rang." Grayson's cleaver paused mid-swing, his eyes narrowing. "Saw me? You're mistaken. I was home, sleeping like any honest man." "Honest men don't skulk by locked towers," she said mildly. "Nor do they leave wires in the grass. I found it, you see, thin, strong, like the kind used to rig a bell. Jacob saw you too, didn't he? That's why he painted you, watching at dusk." The butcher's grip tightened on the cleaver, his knuckles whitening. "You're a meddler, ain't you? Jacob was a fool painting nonsense. I never touched that bell." "Perhaps not directly," Miss Marple conceded, "but someone did. Small footprints, a woman's inside the tower, and you outside working. Together, I'd wager. The bell rings, folk die, and the village blames a curse. Clever, really. Tell me, was it Eliza? She bought wire from Tinker, after all." Grayson's face flushed, a vein pulsing at his temple. "You've got no proof, just guesses. Get out, or—" Before he could finish, a clatter sounded from the back of the shop. Miss Marple turned, catching a glimpse of Eliza darting through the rear door, her apron flapping, a coil of wire tumbling from her hands. Grayson lunged, not at Miss Marple, but toward the door, shouting, "Eliza, wait!" Miss Marple didn't hesitate. She slipped out the front, circling the building to intercept the baker girl as she stumbled into the alley. Eliza's face was pale, her eyes wide with panic. "I didn't mean it," she cried, clutching her arms. "It was him, Grayson. He made me." "Made you what?" Miss Marple asked, her tone calm but firm, blocking Eliza's path. "Rig the bell. Or kill Jacob and Clara?" Eliza shook her head, tears streaking her flour-dusted cheeks. "Not kill, not like that. The bell was a trick, a signal. Grayson said it'd scare folk, keep 'em in line. He hated Jacob, owed him money, hated his prying. I set the wire, and cog to ring it, but the deaths, I don't know how." Miss Marple's mind raced, fitting pieces together. "A signal, you say, for Grayson to act outside, while you hid the how inside. But the deaths weren't part of your plan, were they?" Before Eliza could answer, Grayson barreled into the alley, his cleaver glinting. "Shut your mouth, girl!" he roared, raising the blade. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. Enough, Mr. Grayson. The bell's rung its last for you. Drop that, or the constable will hear more than I've already told him." He froze, chest heaving, the cleaver trembling in his grip. Then, with a snarl, he let it fall, the metal clanging against the cobblestones. Eliza sank to her knees, sobbing, as footsteps pounded closer. Constable Perry, alerted by a passing villager, arrived with handcuffs at the ready. "Take them both," Miss Marple said, her gaze steady. "But we're not done. The bell rang, yes, but something else killed Jacob and Clara, and I mean to find it." As Perry led the pair away, Miss Marple glanced at the tower, its silence now a challenge. Grayson and Eliza had played their parts, but the true killer, the invisible hand, still lurked. The sound of truth had begun to emerge, and she was closer than ever to its source. Chapter 11. The Final Unravelling. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Clary, casting long shadows that stretched toward the bell tower like accusing fingers. Miss Marple stood in the square, her handbag clutched tightly, her mind a whirl of deduction. Grayson and Eliza were in custody, Grayson for his threats and Eliza for rigging the bell, but their confessions had left a gap. The bell was a ruse, a distraction to sow fear, yet Jacob and Clara had died without a mark, their deaths too precise for mere intimidation gone wrong. Someone else had seized the opportunity, turning a prank into murder. She retraced her steps, revisiting the clues, the wire and cog in the bell, the footprints, the note in Clara's hand, the terror in their lifeless faces. Poison, perhaps, or a silent weapon, something subtle, personal. And then there was Mrs. Finch, her grim satisfaction at each death, her tales of the curse spun with relish. The widow's shoes didn't match the tower's prints, but her presence lingered in the story. Too close, too knowing. Miss Marple made her way to the widow's cottage, her knock firm against the weathered door. It creaked open, revealing Mrs. Finch in her black shawl, her flinty eyes narrowing. "You again," she said, her voice sharp. "What now? The butcher and baker locked up. Curse'll take 'em next, mark me." "No curse, Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple replied, stepping inside uninvited. "Just people, and their choices. Grayson and Eliza rigged the bell to frighten the village, but they didn't kill Jacob or Clara. You did." The widow's face hardened, her hands tightening on her shawl. "Me? You're daft, old woman. I've no strength for murder." "Not strength," Miss Marple said, her tone steady. "Cunning. You hated Jacob for mocking your tales. His paintings threatened your grip on the village's fear. And Clara, rumours of her husband's death stung your pride, didn't they? You saw a chance when the bell rang, a cover for your own revenge." Mrs. Finch laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Prove it, then. No marks, no proof." Miss Marple reached into her bag, pulling out a small vial she'd found near Clara's body that morning, overlooked in the chaos, its cap loose, a faint almond scent lingering. "Cyanide," she said. "Quick, silent, slipped into tea or bread. Jacob took tea at your cottage, didn't he, before his last painting? And Clara brought you scones the day she died, your chance to return the favour." The widow's smirk faltered, her eyes darting to the vial. "That's nothing, village gossip." "And the note," Miss Marple pressed, producing it from her pocket. 5 tolls for 5 sins. "Your handwriting, Mrs. Finch, I saw it on your old photographs, the same shaky scrawl. You planted it to fuel the curse, to point away from yourself." Mrs. Finch stepped back, her face twisting. "You can't know that." "I do," Miss Marple said softly. "And I've told Constable Perry to test Clara's scones. Your recipe, I expect. You used the bell's chaos, turned Grayson's trick into your triumph. But the bell betrayed you. It rang without death last night. Because I stopped Grayson before you could act again. The widow lunged, snatching a poker from the hearth, but Miss Marple was ready. She sidestepped, her cane catching Mrs. Finch's ankle, sending her sprawling. The door burst open, Perry and 2 villagers rushing in, summoned by Miss Marple's earlier whisper to a passer-by. "Take her," Miss Marple said, her voice calm as Perry wrestled the poker away. "She's the hand behind the deaths." Mrs. Finch snarled as she was dragged out, her curses echoing through the square. "The bell'll ring for you yet, meddler." Miss Marple watched her go, her expression serene. The mechanism had been Eliza's, the signal Grayson's. But the murders were Mrs. Finch's alone, a bitter woman wielding poison and fear, cloaked in the village's superstition. Jacob's art, Clara's kindness, both snuffed out by a twisted need for control. The tower stood silent now, its tolls explained, its terror undone. One chapter remained, to see justice served, and St. Clary freed from its midnight shadow. Chapter 12. The Bell Falls. The evening sky over St. Clary glowed with the soft amber of dusk, a gentle contrast to the dark days that had gripped the village. Miss Marple stood in the square, her suitcase at her feet, her hat firmly in place as she awaited the train back to St. Mary Mead. The bell tower loomed behind her, its silhouette softened by the fading light, its bronze heart quiet at last. The air felt lighter. The village's tension unravelling like a thread pulled free from a tangled skein. Constable Perry approached, his moustache twitching with a rare smile. "All sorted, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his cap. "Mrs. Finch confessed. Cyanide in the tea for Jacob. A laced scone for Clara. Wanted to punish 'em for what she called sins, using the bell as her stage. Grayson and Eliza'll face charges for the rigging, but it's the widow who's the killer." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes crinkling with quiet satisfaction. "A sad business, Constable. Fear and spite twisted her, and she turned the village's own stories against it. But the bell was never cursed, just a tool for human hands. Aye, and you saw through it," Perry said, shaking his head. "That mechanism, wire cog, a hidden hammer, Eliza's work, tripped by a timer Grayson. Set outside. Fooled us all till you came along." "Not fooled," she corrected gently, distracted. The sound was loud, but the truth was in the silence. The lack of marks, the fear in their eyes. Mrs. Finch counted on superstition to hide her poison. A small crowd gathered nearby. Reverend Hale, looking less haggard now. Eliza's parents, offering sheepish nods. Even Tinker, leaning on his cane, his spectacles glinting. Hale stepped forward, clutching a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Miss Marple, we owe you more than words. This is from the village, a token for your trouble." She unwrapped it to find a small watercolour of the tower, painted by Jacob, its moon a soft silver rather than blood red. "His last peaceful piece," Hale said. "Thought you'd like it." "I shall treasure it," she replied, her voice warm. A reminder that beauty endures even in dark times. The train's whistle sounded in the distance, cutting through the evening calm. Miss Marple turned to Perry. "Keep an eye on St. Clary, Constable. It's a good place, beneath the shadows." He chuckled. "With you gone, I'll have to manage. Safe travels, miss." She boarded the train, settling by the window with the painting in her lap. As the engine chugged to life, she gazed out at the village, its cottages aglow, its people reclaiming their quiet lives. The bell tower stood sentinel, but its midnight voice was stilled, its mystery laid bare by a sound that in the end solved the unsolvable. The train pulled away, and Miss Marple leaned back, a faint smile on her lips. She'd unravel another skein of human nature, and though the world was full of such tangles, she'd always find the thread to pull. For now, St. Clary was at peace, and that was enough.